most amazing thing is being on a show where every day I'm inspired, I am blown away by people doing extraordinary things and come.
Simon, welcome to the show.
Steve, great to be here.
It's a pleasure to finally have you on the show and have you on the other side of the couch and finally get to the bottom of where Startup Daily came from, I guess.
Yeah, you've turned the tables.
I know, and this happened to me the other day, and I quite enjoyed it, to be honest. But so, look, for everyone who's watching, why don't we just give them a quick overview of who you are and what you're doing right now?
Well, I'm Simon Thomsen. I'm editor of startupdaily.net, of course, the preeminent site for startup and tech news in Australia. It's been around for a decade. Matt Beach kicked it off all the way back in 2012. So if you think about that, he was absolutely at the very start of what is now a massive wave in terms of startups and investment and everything else we talk about in this sector.
I didn't know it had been a decade. That was very insightful.
Yeah, if you think about some of the big VC funds, you know, they were all just getting going at that point in time, or they were still a couple of years off.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the very nascent moment. So Matt absolutely spotted the moment when it started to emerge in Australia and launched Startup Daily. And I am now sort of the, what would I say?
Custodian?
Custodian is a great word, actually. I think that's right. I think you're very conscious when you come in as an editor to a title that you're looking after it and representing everything it stood for over those preceding years and continuing that legacy.
And it's so well known. It's so ingrained in the society now. It's part of it. It couldn't exist without it now.
It's a fascinating audience because I do look at the data. I'm a bit of a data guy, so. You know, the fact that it's not just the founders and people working in the sector, but it's government takes a great interest in what we do and what we cover.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Well, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense because, of course, they're investing in the sector too, whether you look at something like the Sydney Startup Hub, Tech Central, which they've just launched down at Central Station, you know, LaunchVic in Victoria. All of those government departments are thinking about how can they help grow the economy, how can they help develop this sector. And when you look at the growth story that a company like Canva brings, you know that there's enormous uplift if you're a government who can back companies like this.
It's extraordinary. We were talking about that this morning, the Canva story. We were just chatting and we were like, gosh, it really is quite unbelievable. It's interesting you mentioned the tech hub. We're moving in there. As soon as it opens, we're going to be moving into that space down by Central. I'm looking forward to that.
Fantastic. I've had a bit of a sneak peek and it is quite beautiful because they use the old building where the clock is at the moment. And it's a great space. You'll have great fun. And of course, it won't be too far once you jump off the train.
No. I used to go into that building when we did government recruitment many years ago. Yeah. And look, let's talk about that because I think as much as you're managing that now, obviously you've had a life before Startup Daily. Why don't we have a quick précis of, you know, where your story came from and how you ended up being, as we talked about, the custodian?
Well, I always wanted to be in journalism. I remember being a teenager and thinking that would be fun. And I looked at a cadetship at the Herald and I remember going out to what was then, I think, Manly Warringah Council, and you had to do a little council report at the time. And that was eye-opening, going to see local government for the first time and watching it happen with the councillors. And this is all the way back in the 80s.
I was going to say, just say the early days. You don't have to put a date on.
Yeah, back when Duran was sort of, massive superstars. But I didn't go down that path at the time. I ended up with a brief flotation in advertising and copywriting. And then I took off overseas, did the rite of passage as a young person in their 20s from Australia and took off to America and then Europe and Asia and had quite a few years away. And that was great fun. Came back to Australia, having worked in hospitality, deciding what I wanted to do.
Yep.
And I went back to uni again up in Lismore, which of course has been in the news of late.
Yes, indeed.
Great little town. I used to call it West Byron Bay because of course everyone knows where Byron is. Not everyone's aware of this regional town of 40,000 people, which, is the hub with a base hospital.
And there was a uni.
Yeah, and the uni. It was UNENR at the time. That had emerged out of the Dawkins reforms, where a whole bunch of technical colleges and everything had been converted into universities. And by the mid-90s, it became standalone as Southern Cross. And I went back there, but I had a part-time job working at a local newspaper, a little independent newspaper. As it turned out, the owners who still have the Byron Echo to this day, which is an enormously successful newspaper that I think has been around for 30 plus years, which is just fantastic because being independent media is pretty hard work, I have to say. But anyway, they decided that they weren't going to continue with the Lismore version. And I was young and foolish in my mid-20s and full of self-belief and thought, well, I'll have a crack at this. And so I bought it off them with a couple of others. And you could almost call it a startup. It was only about 12, 15 months old at that point in time. And it was about building that business at that time. So I got to learn about media, basically with a ringside seat and learning from experience and all the mistakes that, of course, you know as a founder come with that adventure as well. So there was a few howlers along the way, I have to say, but it was a great ride. And I used to describe it as the conversation we have over the back fence. That's what the Northern Rivers Echo was. It was that conversation that people have. So it was all about community and, you know, it wasn't particularly sophisticated. It wasn't trying to win Walkley Awards, but, you know, and I jam everyone in the photo because, of course, they'd all see themselves in the paper. And I don't think you should never lose that thrill, even when you are in media, of what it feels like to be in the media. It's just that excitement that other people can see you, that, you know, you do exist. And that privilege, that opportunity, I think, when you bring it to people is a really important one, and making sure that voices are heard. And it's not always the powerful and the richest and all of those, you know, the small voices are a big part of it as well.
Particularly in that kind of level of media especially.
Yeah, so that was a great adventure for me for nearly 15 years.
Gosh,
we ended up exiting to what was then APN News and Media.
I remember APN.
Yeah, so I mean, eventually that sold to News.
Yep.
So my daily rival was the Northern Star. I've had a little bit of a history of sort of being an underdog media, I suppose is the best way to describe it. I love sort of chasing the market leader. Yeah, having that battle. And so at that point, because I'd also fallen in love with a girl in Sydney, and we'd had our son Archie, I had to rethink my life. We weren't going to stay up there, and I came to Sydney. And as it turned out, it was just at a point where I'd been working with the Herald and Fairfax for several years on a number of fronts. I actually covered one of the floods 20 years ago where, you know, my photos, which were digital. So we started, you know, in that period, you have to think we'd gone from film to digital across the board. So many dramatic technological transformations we'd seen. I'm still proud of the fact to this day. I think it was about 1996, I put up the first website for the Echo. And I actually beat Fairfax, the Herald and the Age, to getting a website up and running in terms of newspapers. But
not a lot of people know that. It's on film now. Everyone knows it.
Because I just thought the internet was extraordinary as a possibility, and the fact that, you know, we were dealing with distribution and printing 35,000 newspapers, and sort of walkers were walking the streets and putting them in letterboxes for us. Suddenly this internet was an opportunity as a distribution channel to completely transform how you did storytelling and who could read it. So there are expat people from around the world who suddenly started emailing me saying, I love the fact that I know what's going on in the Northern Rivers because, you know, you've put the newspaper online. So that was a great adventure.
That's a feather in the cap, is it not?
Yeah. Well, you know, I still remember one of the guys from the university, Chris Go, who, fantastic young man, enthusiastic, was the internet guru. And, you know, as you know in business, the trick is to find someone smarter than you and basically suck their brains out. Yep. You know, Chris was one of those guys. So he did a weekly column, and it was kind of sweet because in some ways he was explaining what email was, how it worked. He was giving recommendations for something to look at on the internet, you know, and it was all of those moments where it was 101 internet in the mid-90s. And it was great just to sort of, it was dial-up, you know. We were talking about, was it 56.6K?
56.5? Yeah, it was something like that. I do remember.
As you dialed in, you know, and knowing you were clogging your phone line for all the time you're on the internet. But
gosh, it's funny to think back to that, isn't it? I forget that you couldn't use your phone when you were on the internet.
But the extraordinary thing is that really is only 25 years ago. So just a generation.
Yeah.
That's how far we've come, how much things have transformed. So yes, my next adventure was restaurant critic for the Sydney Morning Herald. Yes. I ended up in Sydney in the mid-2000s as the editor of the Good Food Guide and the Herald's restaurant critic. Did that for several years, then worked for News, then got back into digital media again because a brand out of the US, Business Insider.
Yes, I love that brand.
Yeah, so that launched in 2013 under Paul Colgan, who I knew from news.com.au. He'd been working there running that, and we teamed up and we had a great adventure for a little over 5 years doing that. And then after that, here I am, Startup Daily for the last 3 years.
Gosh, it's funny you talk about those times. I remember I moved here in 99, but we did a lot of the recruitment in my previous recruitment company for when the Telegraph went digital, when Australian went digital, when News Digital Media, or News Digital as it became, was only 2 people. I remember coming into the Holt Street office, and then obviously they went down to Park Street. Was it Park Street, I think? Opposite the park there, and then they grew to 800 or something. I remember that it was such a massive transformational time in media.
And think about it. I mean, I had this idea for an online real estate agency.
Crazy idea.
Who'd ever buy a house back in the late 90s. Didn't do enough with it, and it was kind of really hard to explain. This is one of those things, I think, especially when you do think a little bit over the horizon, you've then got to have the time and energy to convince everyone else to come along for the ride. So when I did our initial internet thing, I basically viewed it as part of our marketing budget, part of our advertising spend, because I couldn't quite convince local businesses and real estate agents and all those sorts of things that the idea that if you advertise on the internet, it might be a really good thing for you. So, there might be someone in Sydney who wants to buy a property up in this region who won't see the paper, but, could see it on the internet. And of course, look where we are now with realestate.com.au, Domain, all of those.
It's a good book, that Killing Fairfax. We could about that transitional time, right? With the cars and the real estate and all that sort of stuff. It was mad.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary time, and everyone, I think we're still trying to figure out how the internet is shaping media and how it works and how the business model works. It continues to be a challenge.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Web 3.0, how that's going to affect it with the whole virtual reality, and that's really becoming more. And then we're talking about holograms, and there's all these things that are coming out in terms of how media is delivered.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering whether I'm getting old and a little bit traditional now.
I think you'd make a great hologram.
But yeah. So the metaverse, me. It's that thing though of you have to keep your mind open, because you do look back and think, gosh, how far have we come? Could you imagine that you spend most of your life on a device this big, which basically carried everything? Cost almost as much as a computer back in the early 90s.
It's more than a computer now. But you get a laptop far cheaper than a phone.
Yeah. So it's just extraordinary. The Web3, the NFTs, the whole circumstance, I think, will be really interesting to see how it plays out and how much of it does come and go. Because remember MySpace? What a great company that was.
I do remember.
Didn't Tom do well out of that exit to Rupert Murdoch?
Yes, he did. It's funny. There's a few of those companies. I mean, even like you look at companies like Yahoo. They're still around, but they just didn't quite manage to nail that moment as much as the other one, as much as Google obviously did.
And look, I was reading just the other day a story by one of those people who was intimately involved with Amazon in its early days, and this is 20 years ago. They were about 4 weeks from basically filing for bankruptcy. They went so close, just as kind of,
amazing, isn't that?
The dot-com bubble burst, but they were lucky enough to raise just in time. This is a bloke who's now on the board of Linktree, which is absolutely transformed as a category leader, how we connect, in terms of the internet, monetizing what people do as creators. There are those sliding door moments, and I think about that a lot, that, the path you do go down, the decision you make at this moment may be the survival of your company or the end of it.
Not to put too much pressure or heaviness on all the founders out there watching it, but yeah, you're absolutely... Well, let's go back to Startup Daily as well. So, you've been there 3 years now. Obviously, it's had such a massive journey even in that 3 years. If you go back 3 years ago, the startup culture was nothing like it is today. I guess... What's the most extraordinary thing do you think you've seen in that time? Because you would have seen a huge change in just that short period of time.
I think the growth stories, and going back to Canva, that is one of them. Atlassian, of course, which is now a $100 billion company, it listed back in 2015,
Seems
I think it was.
Not as long ago, does it? It's amazing when you think that's 7-8 years ago.
And it's a 20-year-old business now, but Canva is a child of the teens in terms of how old that business is, what Mel, Cliff and Cameron have done in that time to build an extraordinary global company is just one of those remarkable things. And then the other thing that I also think is fascinating is someone who probably I spent a lot of time looking at business back in the 80s when there were the corporate raiders, there were the cowboys, there were some, the Bondies of the world, the Scacers, Homes of Court. It was a pretty Wild West, era in terms of business and how it was conducted. And I kind of think of that now with Mike Cannon-Brookes making his play on AGL, so there's someone who is in the new tech sphere basically picking a fight with a traditional business and sort of saying, hey, you need to transform, you need to do it in a different way, and you need to do it faster. It's the fact that there's a generation now whose values have shifted quite dramatically. So when you've got Mel and Cliff saying we're going to give our money away in our lifetime, and I see it with the Taids at Invato. There's a whole bunch of founders who have this deeper meaning, deeper philosophical underpinning to their success and how they give back. Because the traditional route was, you did get to the end of your career and suddenly you are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or you are Mackenzie Scott, and giving away the wealth that's been accumulated over several decades. That their early success, and they're saying right now, I'm going to act, I'm going to make change, I want to see it happen, and I want to see it happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, they're calling it a lot earlier. They're not waiting till they've sort of retired and the billions are already in there. They're on the journey, and they're already saying before they've even accumulated it, I'm going to give it away. And then
that filters down into their workforce and the way they think and the employees. And I think that's just a remarkable mind shift in the relationship. And as a consequence, we're seeing a new generation coming into the workplace who really start with values and what the company stands for as the reason they go and work there, rather than, how much I'm being paid or, whether I can work from home or not.
No, I mean, look, we've seen that shift probably more so since COVID or during COVID. I think that's probably brought it up to the sort of surface quicker. I think people are far more particular about where they go and work and who they go and work for. I still think that working from home thing is important. That comes up every time we have a conversation. But the values, particularly around environment, and I think the biggest change I've seen is that there's always been companies who've put out about we're environmentally friendly, we've got this policy, we've got that policy, whatever it is. They want to see them living it. They really want to see them living it. I think a good example is there's a company we met who you might know called Wealth. Some really young guys. And
Brody in the team.
Yeah. So I interviewed Brody on the show, and he talks about that a lot, and he talks about his partnership with Parlay and all of that. They won't allow paper cups in their office. If you don't come in with a coffee cup into their office, they're really truly living it. They're not just saying we're doing this as a business, but if you as an individual still want to use a coffee cup, that's fine. They're saying, no, if you want to work for us, you have to live the values that we have as a business. And that means you go and get yourself a reusable coffee cup. And I don't want to see you coming in here with a plastic bottle of any sorts. I'm not necessarily enforcing, but kind of enforcing, but making sure that the people come in there are not playing it lip service because it's a cool thing to do. They truly believe it and they truly live it every moment of the day, rather than just when they decide to give away their money or when they decide to do an event or whatever it is. It's ingrained 24/7. And I think that's the biggest change I've seen with the generation coming through.
And here's the other thing too. I think gone are the days where the CEO, of a major mining company gets up and makes some nice noise about sort of how good and benevolent and kind they are. There's a whole bunch of startups.
Talking about Twiggy?
There's a whole ecosystem. Well, no, Andrew Forrest has been a really interesting transformation in his own way. He's quite passionate about a whole bunch of things. There are some areas where he needs to do a little bit more work, especially around sort of the Indigenous communities he works with. And I think that's a...
Have you read the book?
No, I haven't.
It's good. I read it on holiday just recently, Twiggy. It's an awesome book.
Yeah, all right.
Do read it.
Good. I'll add it to my pile. But the great thing is, I think that it's much clearer, much easier to benchmark now. And the people I interview on Startup Daily are building companies which are making sure that you are answerable and you have clear oversight of how your business is performing when it comes to dealing with things like carbon emissions or anti-slavery or a whole bunch of other areas which are core to being a good corporate citizen.
Yeah, I think you're right. Tell me, I'm sure you get approached a lot on Startup Daily by founders wanting to come on the show and all that kind of stuff. How do you sort of pick the wheat from the chaff? Because as you would know, in the last, let's say 24 months, an extraordinary amount of companies have been funded, an extraordinary amount. Some that perhaps shouldn't have been, arguably, and some that perhaps have missed out. How do you sort of, when people come to you, you've obviously got to decide as an editor, okay, these are the stories we're going to run. These are the people we're going to have on the show. How do you decide that? What's your process? I'm just interested.
I think it's a little bit like the investment community in general. You know, you have to get the measure of the founders and decide, especially on an early stage one. And yes, there are people I've had on the show who I'm just going, yeah, probably not.
Me too.
Longer term. But until you have that conversation, you can't quite pick it because the idea in itself might have merit. You have to get the measure of those involved. And there are some I have regrets. There are some where I come out of the interview going, yeah, we'll see how long it lasts.
Yeah.
But of course, they're the minority. The most amazing thing is being on a show where every day I'm inspired, I am blown away by people doing extraordinary things and coming up with extraordinary solutions to problems. Or as I sometimes say on the show, it's like, this is so obvious. Why didn't anyone think of this beforehand? How come it's you right here, right now, solving this problem, which obviously was staring us all in the face, but none of us acted upon?
It's one or the other for me. I'm either like, oh my gosh, that's so obvious, or oh my gosh, I could never have ever dreamt of that. It's one or there's no halfway. It's either so obvious, it's crazy that we didn't see it, or it's so off the charts unusual that you go, oh my goodness, how does that person's brain work that made them come up with that?
And it's stitching it together. I mean, Linktree is a great example of that. You know, there's an idea that is an obvious solution to what was the problem of only being able to put one URL in your bio, and they came up with this extraordinary solution, which has become a global smash hit. And of course, that there's a little bit of luck in terms of, the likes of Alicia Keys picked up and started using it. And we had that sort of, talk about network effect when you have a moment that. If we could all get an Alicia Keys in our business at one point in time, it would be great. But
if you're watching, Alicia.
Yeah, if you're free. But it is those remarkable moments that just can propel you to the next level. And when you hear those stories, and as I mentioned earlier, there are the moments where it could go down one path, but then you can become that rocket and suddenly you're in outer space. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me, future. Startup Daily, 3 years in, we're going through, as we talked about, an extraordinary time. We've got a little bit of a shift. Interest rates are on the way up, inflation's on the way up. The talk around town with VC funding is it's not going to stop, but that people are going to reinvest in their current investments and less in new. That's what they're saying. Whether that's what happens, we'll see. But they're all raising money, I see, and I think they're finding it a little bit harder to raise money than perhaps they did previously. What's the future for Startup Daily in this new world that's coming, and how do you see it sort of panning out?
Well, I think it's a little bit like markets coverage in general. When it's busy, it's great, and volatility is your friend. There are those moments. Going back to something you asked earlier on, 3 years ago, there was a pretty clear, okay, every announcement happens on a Tuesday, because it aligns with a couple of other media companies who like to line up their ducks for a Tuesday. And so there was, 2 or 3 funding announcements. Nowadays, there are 2 or 3 funding announcements every day from startups, of course. And we've gone from, seed rounds of $250,000, $500,000 to $1 to $7 million. We're seeing Series C's now that are 100 million plus. So there's been this extraordinary growth, and there will still be a lot of capital around. I actually think it will continue. Maybe the bets will be smaller and people will think a little bit more leanly. I think there will be some trimming the sales. When I bought the Echo, that was in the middle of the Keating recession. So, we've heard this discussion around the election at the moment with interest rates, and it's like they were 17%. They generally were 17% on mortgages.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah. We're all leveraged slightly differently at the time, thankfully. But nonetheless, the borrowings from the bank, of course, I had to service the interest on that at the time. And that was a bit torrid for a while. And of course, credit card rates, which haven't moved over the last 30 years, they put them up to 20% at that point in time, and 30 years later left them there. Another story for another time. I think we'll continue to see great ideas will bubble to the surface. Maybe, a few of the outliers, a few of the really crazy flyers may or may not, but there's a broad depth of investors. And not only that, but we're now into this second generation thing where founders who've done well or senior execs of startup companies are now investing as well. So we've created this whole new category of investors, young investors, who are got the sophisticated investor high net worth status and are able to do this. And so that's something that we hadn't seen 10 years ago that we have now. And so I think they will continue to believe, continue to place those small bets. And, you know, we're talking about $20,000, $25,000 rather than the millions that grab the headline every time. And so we'll continue to see these ideas evolve. Of course, we've got the government department. So if you look at Launch Vic and the Alice Anderson Fund, you know, which is backing female founders, I think we'll continue to see those in the early stage funding there. And so the risk is high, but of course your investment is small, has enormous uplift potential. You know, big payoff down the track if it goes well. Look at Blackbird and its early investment in Canva.
They really timed that just beautifully, didn't they?
Well, you know, again, a business is a little bit about luck along the way. And if you're in the right place at the right time and invest in the right company, there you go. You know, if only we'd bought those Facebook shares.
I've got a friend who was in that first fund for Blackbird. He reminds me all the time. It's an extraordinary fund, that first fund. And look, we've also got the Antlers of the world, like pumping out really, I guess, founders with a far more structure than they've ever had before, because they're getting those basics taught to them rather than having to figure them out.
Startup Bootcamp is just in the last couple of weeks announced that they're going to be backing 30 new fintechs, but with a focus on sustainability. So they want to get into that specific area with those values in those businesses to invest in. So we're seeing sort of that, again, going back to that discussion around values, that shift and that focus on that particular area. So I think in that respect, we're going to be building some really great companies that are not just valuable, but bring a lot of value to the table for everyone across society.
Awesome. Well, look, I wish you the best. I'm sure it's going to continue to grow. Your show, you're going to have to start doing 2 a day or something. I'm not sure. The way the sector's growing.
Well, maybe the metaverse can do the second one.
Oh, that's true. You can
I'm a little bit busy between the site, the show, and of course we just launched a podcast called Suds, which is a wrap of the daily show on AusBiz at 2 p.m. every day. So you can listen, you can watch, and you can read. So I kind of, in that way, I suppose, covered most of the bases.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, well, we'll have to promote that podcast for you. But I think also it's time to get holograms. It's Simon holograms everywhere. You can be in 3 places at once finally, and you'll be able to, your workload will go through the roof.
I don't think my teenage kids would appreciate that at any stage.
Well, look, thank you very much for coming. It's good for everyone to hear the story, I think, because a lot of people read it, but they don't necessarily know where it sort of came from and the man behind it properly, because I think not everyone watches the show. A lot of people just get the newsletter, and hopefully this will transition more people to that show too.
Steve, great to have a chat with you and to be on the other side of the fence.
Pleasure.